December 16th, 1944. The frozen silence of the Ardennes forest shattered at dawn. From beneath the skeletal trees came a thunder that split the earth. Over 1,600 German artillery guns opening fire at once. In a matter of minutes, the snow turned black with smoke and torn metal. Hitler had unleashed his last great gamble, the Ardennes offensive, known later as the Battle of the Bulge. His order was brutal and absolute. No retreat, no surrender. 76,000 men were commanded to hold the line, to fight until the last cartridge, the last heartbeat. Across the white fields, American soldiers stumbled from their foxholes, dazed by the bombardment. Communications were cut, skies were dark with storm, and confusion reigned across the Allied front. Somewhere within those forests, entire battalions vanished, not captured, not found, simply erased by the chaos. Hitler's generals whispered that the Führer was no longer fighting the Allies, but time itself. He demanded miracles from men already starving and frostbitten. In hidden bunkers beneath the Eiffel Mountains, maps were spread across oak tables, red arrows stabbing deep into Belgium and Luxembourg. Hitler believed if he could break through to Antwerp, the Western Front would collapse and force the Allies to negotiate. But his army was bleeding from within. Fuel convoys never arrived. Radio operators froze at their posts. And yet, he demanded the impossible, that every man die where he stood. Deep beneath the snow-laden forest floor, Wehrmacht field diaries recorded what the official communiques would never admit. Men were ordered to shoot their own comrades if they attempted to fall back. Entire units were trapped behind collapsing lines, cut off without food or medical aid. The 2nd Panzer Division reported only ghost voices on the radio, men calling for ammunition that no longer existed. As the storm raged, the Ardennes became a graveyard of broken engines and frozen corpses. Hitler's personal adjutants, hidden in the wolf's lair, received daily updates written in code, each more desperate than the last. The truth, sealed within those reports, would remain buried for decades, that this was not merely a battle, but a deliberate act of annihilation. A final test of loyalty, designed to consume the last breath of the Reich's soldiers in fire and ice. By the 3rd day, the Ardennes forest had become a maze of twisted steel and frozen blood. Temperatures fell below -20. The snow was so deep that tanks sank into it like ships caught in a white sea. In those killing woods, the German 12th Volksgrenadier Division tried to hold a line that no longer existed. American artillery pounded the ridges by night, and by dawn, silence returned, only broken by the moans of the wounded. Hitler's orders still echoed through field radios. "Stand fast. Victory will come to the ones who endure." But endurance was no longer humanly possible. Inside a burned-out farmhouse near Bastogne, survivors huddled in the dark. Their bread was frozen solid, their boots filled with ice. They melted snow to drink and used rifle grease to keep their hands from cracking. A young soldier named Erich Bauer wrote in his pocket diary, "We are ghosts in Hitler's dream. He wants us to die so his myth can live." That diary, recovered decades later from a Belgian barn, revealed the madness spreading through the ranks. Soldiers spoke of phantom divisions, of reinforcements that never came, of SS officers shooting men who spoke of retreat. Far behind the front, in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels crafted the illusion of victory. He ordered newsreels showing triumphant marches and smiling soldiers, while the actual footage, columns of frostbitten men staggering through snow, was confiscated and destroyed. Every broadcast was another lie wrapped in patriotic music. The people were told the Führer was at the front, personally commanding the counterattack. In truth, Hitler had not left his underground headquarters in weeks. He studied outdated maps by candlelight, drawing red arrows across regions his armies no longer controlled. His generals tried to reason with him, to tell him the offensive was collapsing, but he would not hear it. The 76,000 soldiers entered. Instead, to hold the Ardennes were no longer an army. They were scattered, starving, hunted. Allied tanks advanced through the fog like beasts of iron. Every forest village turned into a last stand. The frozen bodies of men and horses were used to build walls against shellfire. The air reeked of oil, blood, and despair. And still, the orders came. Hold the line. In those words lay the death sentence of tens of thousands who would never see home again. On December 20th, the fog lifted, revealing the scale of ruin. Columns of German soldiers, frostbitten and starved, lay scattered along the roads leading to St. Vith and Bastogne. What Hitler had called the decisive blow of destiny had become a slaughter without purpose. The sky was streaked with smoke as Allied fighter bombers returned, striking anything that moved. Convoys were obliterated, fuel trucks exploded into burning fountains, and the Ardennes turned into a wasteland of twisted iron and charred snow. American reconnaissance aircraft photographed the destruction from above, but many of those images would remain locked in military archives, too horrific to publish at the time. Among the wreckage, small German units still fought on, cut off and surrounded. Some had no radios, no food, no command. They fought not for the Reich, but for survival. In the diary of Lieutenant Hans Mertens, discovered in a collapsed trench near Houffalize, one line stood out. "We are ordered to hold a line that exists only in Hitler's mind." His last entry ended with the words, "We freeze while Berlin dreams." Within days, his position was overrun, his men buried beneath collapsing snowbanks, marked only by their frozen rifles standing upright in the ground like gravestones. Inside Hitler's command bunker at the Adlerhorst, the atmosphere had turned from triumph to paranoia. His aides reported that he spoke of invisible battalions and divine weather that would shield his troops. When told the offensive had stalled, he raged that defeat was a lie spread by cowards. General Model, the field commander, tried to salvage what remained, pleading for permission to withdraw to defensible lines. The answer came back: stand fast or be replaced. It was the same message sent to every division commander from the Führer's headquarters. Across the frozen rivers, German medical officers worked in makeshift shelters dug into hillsides. The wounded lay side by side, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the dark. Morphine was gone. Bandages were torn from the dead. Some men begged to be shot rather than left to freeze. Others whispered prayers to no one. The Ardennes had become an open graveyard, stretching from Luxembourg to the Meuse. By the end of that week, of the 76,000 ordered to hold the line, entire regiments had vanished. Hitler would call them heroes. History would never call them back. By Christmas Eve of 1944, the Ardennes was a land of ghosts. The snow no longer looked white. It was gray with ash, soaked with the memory of burning men and machines. The German offensive was dying, but Hitler refused to admit it. He sent new orders written in his own trembling hand. Bastogne must not fall. Hold every position to the last man. Those words sealed the fate of thousands who would never see another sunrise. Bastogne, surrounded by German troops, was meant to be crushed within days. Instead, it became a fortress of defiance. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held firm under siege, their courage feeding Allied resolve and turning Hitler's dream into his nightmare. Inside the encirclement, German divisions were disintegrating, communications collapsed, ammunition ran out. The 26th Volksgrenadiers were down to 40% strength. SS officers executed men accused of cowardice, their bodies left half buried in the snow as warnings. One captured order, later found in an abandoned headquarters, read, "Every step back is treason against the Führer." But there was nowhere left to stand. Fuel shortages crippled entire armored divisions. Tiger tanks stood motionless, entombed in ice, their engines silent monuments to a war that could no longer move. In Berlin, Hitler's inner circle met in candlelit war rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and denial. Maps covered the walls, the red arrows of advance frozen in place. Göring boasted that his Luftwaffe would deliver supplies by air, but the skies belonged to the Allies now. Goebbels continued his radio broadcasts, calling the counterattack a turning point of destiny. The truth was unspeakable. Hitler had sent his last reserves into a storm they could never escape. In a farmhouse outside L'Église, a war correspondent found a dead officer clutching a note, Oak. Inside were lists, names of the dead, coordinates of lost platoons, and one chilling entry written in red pencil, no reinforcements, no fuel. We hold until death. The handwriting ended abruptly, mid-sentence, frozen to the page. The officer's body was later identified as Major Kurt Reiner of the 2nd SS Panzer. His final position was overrun that night, wiped from the map by Allied artillery. The line Hitler demanded still held, but only in his imagination, drawn in blood upon the snow. On December 26th, the Allied skies opened. The long, suffocating fog that had shielded the German advance finally broke apart, and with it came the roar of vengeance. Hundreds of Allied aircraft, Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and Mustangs, streaked over the frozen forests, hunting columns of German armor retreating through narrow, icy roads. It was no longer a battle. It was an execution. Convoys of trucks, horse carts, and tanks were torn apart in minutes. Men who had survived weeks of starvation now ran for cover beneath a storm of fire and steel. The snow turned red beneath them. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but it was a shadow of its former self. Pilots barely in their 20s flew outdated planes with empty fuel tanks, ordered to defend skies already lost. Hitler had promised them air superiority through new wonder weapons, jet fighters and guided bombs, but they existed mostly on paper. The few Me-262 jets that did appear were too few, too late. The promise of salvation through technology became another cruel illusion whispered into the cold. Meanwhile, deep within Hitler's command complex, reports flooded in. Towns lost, divisions annihilated, officers missing. Yet, none of it changed the orders. From Berlin, the directive came again. Every man must fight to the last, no retreat. Those who dared to question it were replaced or executed. The once proud German army, built on precision and discipline, was now an army of desperation, dying for lines on a map that no longer meant anything. In the village of Mannheim, a group of German soldiers attempted to surrender. They raised a white cloth over their trench, but the shells kept falling. No one could tell who was shooting at whom anymore. By nightfall, the entire unit was gone, erased by artillery. When Allied troops later entered the ruins, they found a single sign nailed to a barn door, written in char. Coal by a dying soldier, we obeyed. That message, brief and final, became a silent epitaph for the 76,000 men sent to hold the impossible. As New Year's approached, the last of Hitler's great offensives lay shattered beneath the winter moon. But in Berlin, the propaganda still called it a strategic withdrawal. The truth was too dark for even the Reich to speak aloud. The truth that only 3,000 of those ordered to hold the line would live to tell what they saw. By the final days of December, the German army in the Ardennes had ceased to exist as a unified force. Commanders were gone, supply routes obliterated, radios silent. Men stumbled through forests in small, desperate groups, frostbitten, starving, hunted. They tore insignia from their uniforms to avoid recognition by SS patrols that still prowled the woods, executing anyone accused of desertion. In the scattered ruins of villages, survivors hid among corpses for warmth, burning fragments of field maps to keep their fingers from freezing. The last remnants of the 560th Volksgrenadier Division were cornered near the Amblève River. Of its thousands of soldiers, fewer than 100 remained. The snow concealed the horror. Beneath the white crust lay fields of the dead, men, horses, tanks frozen in grotesque stillness. American engineers clearing roads would later describe columns of death, entire convoys encased in ice as if time itself had stopped. Helmets and rifles jutted from the drifts like tombstones. In a forest clearing near Trois Ponts, a field medic named Otto Skorzeny recorded his final entry. "The forest is silent now. We have no ammunition. The wounded no longer cry." His notebook was recovered in 1952, the pages still stained with blood. Far away in Berlin, Hitler refused to believe the truth. He raged against his generals, accusing them of betrayal. He shouted that destiny itself had turned against him. The walls of the Führer bunker echoed with madness, maps torn apart, telephones smashed. He blamed everyone except himself, his field marshals, the weather, even the German people for not being worthy of victory. Yet, in those final days of the offensive, reports continued to reach his desk. They told of regiments wiped out to the last man, of entire divisions missing, of soldiers freezing to death in silence. He signed each report with a single word: Weiterkämpfen. Keep fighting. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne finally broke free, aided by General Patton's tanks. The German encirclement collapsed in days. Prisoners were rounded up by the thousands, though most were too weak to stand. When Allied photographers arrived, they captured faces hollowed by hunger, men who looked twice their age. Those photographs were classified for months, not for military reasons, but because they were too painful to print. The men in them had followed their orders faithfully, and for that obedience, they had been destroyed. January 1945 arrived with a silence more terrifying than any bombardment. The German line, what was left of it, had collapsed completely. The survivors were retreating east through snow-choked valleys, pursued day and night by Allied armor. What had begun as Hitler's last great gamble now became the longest funeral march of the war. Roads once meant for tanks were filled with broken men dragging their wounded comrades on sleds made from door panels. Frozen corpses lined the ditches, each one wearing the same expression: not fear, but disbelief. In the hidden command posts of the Wehrmacht, officers burned documents and destroyed radio codes. No one dared to admit the truth aloud. The Führer's final offensive had become the Reich's death warrant. Hitler still demanded that towns be held at all costs. Those orders, transmitted through half-frozen wires, reached units that no longer existed. One intercepted radio message, recorded by Allied intelligence near Spa, read simply, "We are surrounded. There is no line. There is only snow." It was the last transmission of the 18th Volksgrenadier Regiment. As the Allies advanced, they began to uncover the full extent of the destruction. Villages that had changed hands 3 times were reduced to ashes. Basements filled with civilians, old men, women, children, lay buried under collapsed roofs. The Ardennes, once a quiet region of forests and streams, had become a landscape of death. American engineers, clearing the roads toward Houffalize, stumbled upon frozen field hospitals filled with both German and American wounded, abandoned when the front shifted overnight. They found letters on the bodies, messages never sent, written to mothers, wives, children. The snow preserved the ink as if refusing to let those words disappear. In one recovered diary belonging to a chaplain of the Panzer Lehr Division, a haunting line appeared: "We fight for a man who no longer fights for us." That entry, dated January 4th, was the last. His body was never found. When post-war investigators pieced together the records, the arithmetic of the Ardennes was staggering. Out of the 76,000 Germans ordered to hold the line, fewer than 3,000 remained alive, and half of those were captured or crippled. Hitler had sacrificed an entire army to a delusion, a line drawn not on the map of Europe, but in the crumbling mind of a dying dictator. In the aftermath of the Ardennes, the survivors returned not as soldiers, but as shadows. Those 3,000 who escaped death were scattered across field hospitals and prison camps, many unable to speak of what they had endured. The war had not only broken their bodies, it had erased their purpose. Among them were veterans of every front, men who had fought at Kursk, Normandy, and the eastern steppes. Now, their memories blended into one endless nightmare of cold and silence. In American POW camps, interrogators recorded their testimonies, though much of what they said never reached official reports. Some spoke of phantom commands, of orders arriving from non-existent divisions, of officers who vanished into the woods after declaring that the Reich is already dead. In one interrogation log from January 1945, an Oberfeldwebel from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division described the final hours before his capture. He said his commander received a call directly from Hitler's headquarters. The voice on the line was not the Führer, but one of his adjutants, reading the same words that had doomed them all. "Hold the line. The future of Germany depends on you." The officer had stared at the phone for a long time, then walked outside into the snow and shot himself. His men buried him where he fell. The sergeant's last remark to his captors was simple: "We obeyed until there was nothing left to obey." As Allied forces pushed eastward, they found hundreds of abandoned German positions filled with evidence of a madness that could no longer be explained by strategy. Field reports documented soldiers freezing beside crates of ammunition they could not use, or dying of hunger while warehouses nearby were filled with supplies marked, "For the Führer's headquarters only." The discipline of the German army had turned into a form of suicide, obedience as destruction. In Berlin, Lear's generals began to conceal the real casualty numbers from him. Goebbels' propaganda ministry issued new headlines calling the Ardennes a heroic delay of the inevitable. But the truth was seeping out, even among the loyal. In one private letter intercepted by Allied intelligence, an officer wrote, "We are defending a corpse, and the corpse is giving orders." The line that 76,000 men had been told to hold no longer existed. Only their silence remained, frozen into the ground of the Ardennes like a secret no one dared to unearth. By mid-January 1945, what was left of the German army staggered back across the Rhine. The Ardennes had devoured its last strength. The dream of splitting the Allied front was gone. In its place lay a wasteland of burned forests and frozen corpses. But for Hitler, defeat had become an abstract concept. He refused to see the photographs sent from the front, images of his soldiers lying face down in the snow, their rifles still clutched in hands turned blue with frost. When generals tried to speak of withdrawal, he silenced them with rants about destiny and divine justice. To him, the war was no longer a military operation. It was a ritual, a sacrifice to his own illusion of immortality. Inside the Führer bunker, reports were rewritten before being shown to him. Losses were minimized, victories fabricated. Goebbels staged new radio broadcasts describing how fresh German reserves were regrouping for another counteroffensive. In truth, there were no reserves left. The Wehrmacht was collapsing under the weight of its own loyalty. Even the SS divisions, once the symbol of unbreakable fanaticism, had begun to fracture. Deserters were hanged from lampposts in the villages near Cologne, their corpses left as warnings to the rest. The order remained unchanged. Fight to the last. Among the files recovered after the war was a chilling memorandum written by General Jodl during the final days of the Ardennes. It stated, "Losses are no longer relevant. Victory or extinction. There is no alternative." Historians later called it the Reich's suicide note. Those words were not metaphorical. Hitler's inner circle believed that if Germany could not win, it must not survive. The 76,000 men in the Ardennes had been the first victims of that belief. In the forests of Belgium, graves began to thaw as the winter softened. Local villagers uncovered what the snow had hid, fields filled with bodies still frozen in their final gestures of defiance. Many had no identification, their faces unrecognizable. Farmers buried them in mass graves, marking them only with simple wooden crosses. For years after the war, unexploded shells and bones would surface each spring. The earth refused to forget. Beneath every tree and ridge, the ghosts of those ordered to hold the line still lingered, trapped between duty and oblivion. The silent testament to a nation that had destroyed itself from within. In the months that followed the Ardennes disaster, the truth was buried beneath layers of propaganda and fear. The Nazi regime declared the battle a strategic delay, claiming that the sacrifice of thousands had bought Germany precious time. But within the secret archives of the Wehrmacht, the actual figures told a different story, an extinction recorded in ink and silence. Every surviving report from the front carried the same line: unit no longer operational. The men who had once believed they were defending the fatherland had been consumed by a delusion crafted in Berlin. The High Command called it heroism. The soldiers who lived through it called it betrayal. In February 1945, Allied war correspondents entered the ruined towns of the Ardennes. They found diaries frozen to corpses, photographs still tucked into breast pockets, letters never sent. One notebook belonged to a 17-year-old German soldier named Lucas Meinhardt. His last words, scrawled in pencil, read, "The snow covers everything, even our shame." The Allies buried him in an unmarked grave beside the road to Malmedy. His story, like thousands of others, was never officially recorded. The Reich had no place for martyrs who questioned orders. As the war drew closer to Germany's borders, a strange silence spread through its cities. Families who had cheered Hitler's triumphs now spoke in whispers. The government forbade mourning the dead of the Ardennes, insisting instead on celebrations of heroic endurance. Newspapers printed lists of medals awarded posthumously, iron crosses given to men whose bodies were never found. In some villages, widows received telegrams weeks apart. Your husband has fallen in honor. No location, no grave. Just a sentence written to fill the void. Historians later discovered that in the Reich Chancellery's underground archive, Goebbels ordered an entire collectus of Ardennes casualty reports destroyed in March 1945. His reason was chillingly simple: to preserve morale for the final battle. Those files, tens of thousands of names, vanished in the flames as Berlin prepared for its end. Only fragments survived, rescued from bombed offices and abandoned trucks. They spoke of frostbite, starvation, suicide, and executions, of a winter where loyalty became death itself. The 76,000 who were told to hold the line had not died for Germany's future. They had died to keep a lie alive for a few more weeks. By March 1945, the echoes of the Ardennes had faded into the roar of a collapsing Reich. The Western Front had been torn open, and the Allied armies poured into Germany like a tide of vengeance. Yet in the ruined corridors of the Führerbunker, Hitler still spoke of victory. He issued new commands to divisions that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks from armies buried beneath the snow of Belgium. When his generals tried to reason with him, he accused them of treason. His voice, once the roar of a nation, had become the broken whisper of a man drowning in his own delusion. Outside Berlin, refugees fled eastward in endless lines. Civilians, wounded soldiers, children dragging sleds piled with what was left of their lives. The roads were filled with smoke from burning villages, set ablaze by their own defenders to slow the Allied advance. Among the retreating columns were the few survivors of the Ardennes, men hollowed by hunger and frostbite, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes fixed on nothing. Some were reassigned to new units that existed only on paper. Others were sent to dig trenches around Berlin, defending ruins with shovels and broken rifles. They were the last ghosts of Hitler's great gamble, walking reminders of his madness. Captured German officers, interrogated after the war, would speak cautiously of the orders that had condemned them. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded during the offensive, admitted that he knew it was hopeless from the beginning. "But we could not refuse," he said. "Refusal was death." He described how every field commander received personal directives from Hitler's headquarters, signed with the words, "Stand or die." Even when ammunition was gone, when fuel had frozen, those orders continued, as if obedience alone could conjure victory from ruin. As spring thawed the Ardennes, Allied recovery teams unearthed final evidence of the slaughter. Frozen bunkers filled with letters unsent, abandoned tanks whose engines had been run until they exploded, trenches packed with bones still wearing steel helmets. One American officer, writing in his report, said, "It felt as if the forest itself was mourning." The 76,000 men who had once stood under Hitler's command were now indistinguishable from the earth they died upon. Only 3,000 had survived, and even they carried a silence too heavy for words. A silence that would outlive the Reich itself. April 1945. Berlin was burning. The walls of the Reich Chancellery trembled with every artillery strike as the Soviet guns closed in. Above ground, the city was rubble. Below, in the Führer bunker, the man who had once commanded continents now sat hunched over a map of Europe that no longer existed. Hitler still issued orders to units that were gone, still spoke of counterattacks from divisions that had perished in the Ardennes. Those 76,000 men, the ones he had promised victory, were now his invisible army, ghosts he invoked to deny the truth. He told his adjutants that the failure at the Ardennes was not defeat, but divine punishment for weakness. To him, their deaths were necessary, the price of faith. In those final weeks, fragments of reality still reached Berlin. General Alfred Jodl reported that entire sectors had collapsed, that the Americans and Soviets would soon meet at the Elbe. Hitler listened in silence, then ordered total war. Every man, woman, and child was to fight. It was the final echo of the Ardennes command, hold the line until death. This time, the line ran through the heart of his own capital. Goebbels repeated the order across the radio. Resistance to the last breath is the greatest honor a German can achieve. No one dared to say what everyone knew, that the war was lost months ago, buried beneath the snow of Belgium. As Berlin fell into chaos, the survivors of the Ardennes, those few who had returned, were among the last to defend the ruins. Many were unrecognizable, old before their time, their uniforms mismatched, their weapons scavenged from the dead. They fought not for victory, but because they no longer knew how not to fight. For them, surrender was unthinkable. They had survived Hitler's orders once, and now they would die fulfilling them again. On April 30th, as the Soviet troops closed within blocks of the bunker, Hitler finally faced the end he had long denied. Outside, artillery shells tore through the streets where his last soldiers, boys and broken veterans, fired until their rifles melted. In his final hours, he looked at the map one last time, his shaking hand tracing the lines of the Ardennes, the last offensive, the last illusion. When he ended his life moments later, he left behind a nation in ruins and the unburied memory of 73,000 men who had frozen, burned, and vanished obeying his command. The Reich had died long before he did. It had died in the snow. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe exhaled. But the silence that followed was heavy, haunted, unfinished. The Battle of the Bulge, once cloaked in Nazi propaganda as a symbol of German willpower, now stood revealed as a monument to futility. Allied investigators pored over the wreckage of the Ardennes, documenting the scale of destruction. They found miles of forests scorched black, villages erased, and rivers clogged with debris and the remains of soldiers from both sides. The snow was gone, but its secrets began to thaw with the earth. Beneath every ridge lay evidence of the regime's last delusion. Men sacrificed not for victory, but for an illusion drawn in the mind of one dying dictator. Documents uncovered in abandoned German headquarters told a story darker than anyone had imagined. Orders were found demanding no retreat under any circumstance, even after communication lines had been cut. Reports revealed entire regiments ordered to hold imaginary positions long after their flanks had disappeared. One chilling note, signed by an SS field commander, read, "If the line no longer exists, make it exist with your bodies." Such lines, historians later said, defined not military strategy, but ritualized death. Hitler had transformed war into a religion of sacrifice, and his soldiers were the unwilling saints. In post-war interrogations, captured German officers described the Ardennes as the grave of reason. Some wept as they spoke, recalling comrades frozen beside burning tanks, men who refused to retreat even when ordered by American forces to surrender. They said the indoctrination ran deeper than fear, that even in their final hours, they believed Hitler would find a way to turn defeat into triumph. That faith, shattered at last, left behind only emptiness. Across the Ardennes, Allied recovery teams began the grim work of burial. Mass graves were dug in the same fields where Hitler's divisions had stood their ground. American and German dead were buried side by side, enemies in life, equals in death. In 1947, when the first memorials were erected, locals spoke of nights when the forest still echoed faintly with gunfire, or when mist rose over the meadows like breath. Whether superstition or memory, the Ardennes remained a scar that refused to heal. The place where obedience had frozen into silence, and where 76,000 men learned too late that loyalty could be more fatal than war itself. Years after the war ended, historians began to uncover what official records had long concealed: that the tragedy of the Ardennes was not a miscalculation, but a deliberate act of deception from within the Nazi command. Declassified intelligence files from the Allied side revealed that German officers knew by early December 1944 that the offensive was doomed before it began. Fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and impossible weather conditions had made success unattainable. Yet, the orders came directly from Hitler himself, and disobedience meant death. It was not strategy that drove the 76,000 men into the snow. It was fear, faith, and the myth of the Führer's infallibility. The diaries of surviving officers, smuggled out of Germany after the war, paint a chilling picture. One general wrote, "We no longer fight the enemy. We fight the Führer's dreams." Another recorded that SS units were instructed to execute all defeatists, a policy that turned entire regiments against their own men. In the forest near Stavelot, bodies were found with bullet wounds to the back of the head, German soldiers shot by their comrades for speaking of retreat. These scenes never appeared in newsreels or archives. They were erased, classified, or dismissed as unverified incidents. But the diaries remained, their ink faded, but their truth unyielding. Post-war investigators also discovered a darker dimension to the Ardennes offensive: Operation Greif, a covert plan ordered by Hitler and led by SS commando Otto Skorzeny. German soldiers, disguised in American uniforms, infiltrated Allied lines to spread chaos and misinformation. They changed road signs, cut communication wires, and ambushed convoys, creating hysteria across the front. When captured, they were executed as spies. Many of them had been young, barely trained, chosen not for skill, but loyalty. Their mission, to prolong a hopeless war by deceit, symbolized the regime's descent into madness. By 1950, military analysts on both sides agreed that the Ardennes had been the last and most futile act of Hitler's tyranny, a human sacrifice disguised as a military operation. It achieved nothing but death. The men who froze beneath the trees had not fallen in battle. They had been murdered by the very command they swore to obey. And though history recorded the dates, the battles, and the strategies, the one truth that lingered in silence was this: those 76,000 soldiers had not died in defeat. They had died in obedience to a lie, In the decades that followed, the Ardennes forest grew quiet again. Trees reclaimed the craters. Moss crept over rusted helmets, frozen rifles, and unmarked graves. The snow that once buried the dead now blanketed a landscape of remembrance and denial. Local villagers told stories of the winter of 1944 as though it were a curse, passed from generation to generation. Sometimes, they said, when the wind cut through the forest at night, it carried the echo of men shouting in languages long silenced. Orders, prayers, screams, carried through 70 years of haunted wind. But as historians unearthed the hidden documents of the Reich, a final revelation emerged, one that reshaped the understanding of those last days. Hitler's command to hold the line at all costs had not been a spontaneous order of desperation. It had been drafted weeks earlier, before the first shot was fired. In those pages, stamped Geheime Reichssache, top secret of the Reich, the Führer declared that any man who retreated betrays Germany itself. It was, in essence, a death warrant for his own army. The words were signed in trembling ink, as if written by a man already consumed by madness. When American researchers found these documents in 1946, they were quietly archived, never shown to the public. To reveal them would have exposed the true depth of the regime's delusion, that its final battle was not fought against the Allies, but against the truth itself. Hitler's obsession with control had turned the Wehrmacht into a funeral procession. 76,000 marched under banners of glory, and only 3,000 returned to tell what they had seen. Their testimonies were fractured, half-whispered, and often ignored. Some spent the rest of their lives in silence, unable to reconcile survival with loyalty. Today, the Ardennes remains a museum of ghosts. Beneath its soil lie remnants of Shah, addered helmets, frozen letters, and human stories that never reached home. Every winter, frost forms over the ground where those men stood, as though the earth still remembers their suffering. And in that silence, colder than the snow, heavier than the years, lies the truth of Hitler's last command. It was not a military order. It was the confession of a man who had already lost everything, demanding that his soldiers die so he would not die alone. The line they held was not the border of Germany. It was the edge of sanity itself,